Life is full of moments that we take for granted. We live through them day after day, convinced that we understand the people around us, the roles we play, the rules we follow. But sometimes, life doesn't follow the rules. Sometimes, it throws you into situations you never saw coming, situations that make you question everything you thought you knew. This story isn't just about what happened one night during a camping trip. It's about choices, trust, and the quiet, unspoken dynamics that shape our lives. And it all began with something as simple as a neighbor. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, a chance to get away from the noise of the city and reconnect with the basics. A few families from the neighborhood had planned the trip for weeks, arranging every detail. The carpooling, the shared supplies, even the meals we'd cook over the fire. It felt wholesome. I went along, not expecting anything out of the ordinary. The campsite was beautiful, nestled in a quiet stretch of woods, far from the hum of traffic and the glow of streetlights. The trees stretched high above us, their branches framing a sky that seemed to go on forever. It was the kind of place where you could let your guard down, where everything felt simpler, quieter, safer. And then there was her, my neighbor's wife. She wasn't someone I'd paid much attention to before. She had a presence about her, though, not loud or commanding, but calm, steady. She carried herself with a kind of quiet confidence, the way someone does when they're comfortable in their own skin. She was always polite, always composed. The kind of person you'd trust without a second thought. We hadn't spoken much before that trip, just casual greetings, the occasional small talk at neighborhood gatherings. But that weekend, I began to notice things. The way she laughed at a joke, the way she listened when others spoke. It wasn't anything obvious, nothing you could point to, just a feeling. The day passed without incident. We set up camp, cooked dinner over the fire, and shared stories under the stars. It was easy, familiar, the kind of night that reminds you why these trips matter. But as the fire burned low and people began to retreat to their tents, something unexpected happened. A mix-up. My tent wasn't ready. Missing stakes, a problem with the setup. It was nothing major, just one of those small inconveniences you brush off when you're camping. But it meant I needed to share a tent for the night. And as fate would have it, her tent was the only one with enough space. I hesitated for a moment, but only a moment. It seemed harmless. Why wouldn't it? We were neighbors, after all. Friends, even. What could possibly happen? When I entered the tent, she looked up, a warm, welcoming smile on her face. We joked about the situation, laughed about how camping always came with its little surprises. She gestured for me to settle in, her tone light, her demeanor completely at ease. As we talked, she mentioned her husband. He had planned to join us on the trip but had been called away at the last minute for work. She spoke about how disappointed he'd been, how this was supposed to be a chance for him to unplug, to reconnect with her and the kids. But now, it was just her, trying to make the most of the weekend. "I guess it's just one of those things," she said with a shrug. Her voice tinged with both understanding and a hint of something unspoken. We laughed about the irony, about how life always seemed to have other plans. And for a while, it felt natural, easy. Like nothing about it should have felt unusual. But here's the thing about moments like this, they rarely announce themselves. You don't always see the turning point when it's happening. It's only later, sometimes much later, that you realize you crossed a line. Have you ever found yourself in a situation you never anticipated? A moment where you suddenly realized the ground beneath you had shifted, and nothing would ever be the same? That night, as the forest settled into silence and the soft rustle of leaves played in the background, something shifted. I couldn't explain it then, and I'm not sure I can now. But in the quiet of that tent, under the cover of darkness, everything changed. Some secrets are easy to keep. Others weigh on you, not because you want to share them, but because they become a part of you. A part you carry, quietly, through every moment that follows. Before we dive in, let me ask you, have you ever kept a secret that could change everything? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's connect, because sometimes, the hardest stories to tell are the ones we need to share the most. And that's where my story begins. A decision made in the quiet of a tent, one that I never thought I'd make, and one I'll never forget. The night had settled in like a blanket, covering the campsite in a cool, gentle embrace. The fire had long since flickered out, leaving only the glow of the lantern to light the inside of the tent. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. The kind of fresh, outdoor air that makes you feel more alive, but also more vulnerable. We both sat there, facing each other, just a few feet apart. The tent was small, just big enough for the two of us. The closeness was palpable, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Not yet. It was just different. In that quiet space, I could hear the soft rustle of the tent fabric as the wind tugged at the edges. A far-off owl hooted in the distance, and the crackling of the fire from the other side of camp seemed like an echo from another world. "It's funny, isn't it?" she said, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "How things never turn out the way you expect." I nodded, unsure of how to respond. There was something in her tone, something that made me feel like she wasn't just talking about the trip, but something deeper. But she didn't elaborate, and I didn't press. We continued to talk, shifting from one topic to another. The conversation was light, even playful, but there was a certain undercurrent I couldn't ignore. I could feel it in the way she laughed, in the way her eyes lingered a moment too long when they met mine. It wasn't flirtation, not in the obvious sense. But there was a connection, something unspoken. Something that neither of us acknowledged, but both felt. The warmth of the lantern seemed to draw us in, creating a bubble of intimacy that neither of us had expected. It wasn't that we were close in the physical sense, but there was a shared space between us, a kind of quiet understanding that grew with each passing minute. Her breath became a little more measured, her movements more deliberate, as if the closeness between us had heightened everything. I could feel the weight of it, the way she shifted slightly, adjusting her position, her body subtly leaning closer to mine. I shifted too, half out of instinct, half out of something else I couldn't quite explain. The night was growing colder, but it wasn't the chill of the air that made me feel unsettled. It was the way our proximity was beginning to alter the dynamic between us. She reached for the blanket and draped it over both of us without a word. The small, casual gesture felt intimate, the heat from her body radiating through the fabric, and for a moment, everything around us disappeared. There was an undeniable pull. Something in the way her presence filled the space, something that made it feel like we were alone in the world. The silence between us had thickened, and I realized I was paying more attention to the way her fingers brushed against mine than I had any right to. We both knew it. For a moment, we said nothing, the weight of the quiet heavier than words could ever be. It felt like the world was holding its breath. But then she spoke again, her voice low, almost hesitant. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," she said, looking away, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the lantern. "But things have been hard lately. With him. With my husband. I'm not sure what I expected this weekend to be, but it wasn't this." I couldn't help but listen. I didn't know what to say, but the vulnerability in her voice caught me off guard. There was a rawness there. Something personal, something deeply human. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, a thudding rhythm I couldn't ignore. She wasn't just talking about her husband, was she? There was something more. Something between us that had grown in the quiet spaces. "You don't have to explain," I said, my voice barely a whisper. The words felt too heavy, like they were carrying more weight than I intended. "I understand more than you think." And in that moment, everything shifted again. Her gaze met mine, and the air between us seemed to thicken. She didn't pull away. Neither of us did. And for a second, time seemed to stop. There was a soft tension in the way we looked at each other, an unspoken understanding that neither of us could deny. And that's when it happened. Her hand, tentative at first, moved toward mine, fingers brushing against the back of my hand. It wasn't a strong grip, but it was enough to send a shock through me, enough to make the room feel smaller, more intense. My breath caught in my throat, and I could see the conflict in her eyes. She wasn't sure either, but she didn't pull away. I should have stopped it. I should have pulled back. The rational part of me knew this wasn't right, knew the risks, knew the consequences. But in that moment, something inside me faltered. It was a decision made without words, but it was a decision nonetheless. There was no going back now. As I turned toward her, the world outside the tent faded. There was only us. Only the warmth of the blanket, the soft glow of the lantern, and the shared silence that felt like both an invitation and a warning. And then it happened. A moment that, in the grand scheme of things, was just a few seconds, but one that would haunt me forever. The line had been crossed. In that brief instant, something shifted permanently. What had been a casual camping trip, something so simple, so innocent, had turned into something far more complicated. It's easy to look back on moments like these and wonder, what was I thinking? Why didn't I stop? But the truth is, in that moment, I wasn't thinking at all. I wasn't considering the consequences or the fallout. I was simply caught up in the heat of the moment, the rush of emotions, the vulnerability, and the connection. As humans, we are impulsive creatures. We act on desires, emotions, and instincts, often without considering the long-term effects. In some ways, we're wired to follow the moment, to give in to the pull of connection when it feels like everything else fades away. But that's the danger, isn't it? Because sometimes, the moment that feels the most right is the one that changes everything. This isn't just about me. This is about all of us. The decisions we make in a split second, the choices that define us in ways we never saw coming. This moment, it was one of those choices. And looking back, I wonder, if I had stopped, would everything have been different? Sometimes, it's not the big things that change our lives. It's the small decisions. The ones we think are insignificant, until they're not. I didn't sleep much that night. After she left the tent in the early hours of the morning, I lay there, staring at the canvas above me, replaying every moment, every word, every touch. The quiet of the camp felt deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or a distant owl's hoot. As the first light of dawn crept in, I could hear the others stirring, her husband's voice among them, groggy and cheerful as he greeted the day. I felt my stomach twist, the reality of what had happened hitting me all over again. I stepped out of the tent, forcing a casual smile, but inside, it felt like the ground beneath me had shifted. She was there too, moving around the campsite with practiced ease, her expression calm and composed. You'd never guess that just hours earlier, we'd crossed a line we could never uncross. She caught my eye briefly, and in that fleeting glance, there was an understanding, a silent agreement. What happened between us would stay between us. Forever. There were no words exchanged about it, but the weight of that unspoken pact hung heavy in the air. Later that morning, as we packed up and prepared to leave, I found myself watching her. She laughed at her husband's jokes, helped him load their gear into the car, and played the role of the devoted wife effortlessly. I wondered how she could compartmentalize it all so easily, how she could act like nothing had changed. And yet, maybe she wasn't as unaffected as she seemed. There were moments, tiny, fleeting moments, when her mask slipped. A hesitation in her laughter. A glance held a second too long. It was in those moments that I saw it. The same mixture of guilt and longing that was tearing me apart. Coming back home should have been a relief, a return to normalcy. But it wasn't. If anything, it made everything harder. The first time I saw her husband after the trip, I felt like I couldn't breathe. He was the same as always, warm, friendly, completely unaware. He asked about the trip, joked about the bad coffee at the campsite, and invited me over for drinks the following weekend. I nodded, smiled, and agreed, all while feeling like an imposter in my own skin. And then there was her. Seeing her again for the first time after the trip was like reopening a wound that hadn't even begun to heal. She was polite, friendly, the perfect neighbor. But there was something in her eyes, a flicker of recognition, of memory, that made my chest tighten. We avoided being alone together, both of us too aware of the danger in that. But the tension was always there, just beneath the surface, simmering quietly. There were moments when it felt almost unbearable. Like the time I ran into her at the grocery store. We exchanged pleasantries, our voices steady and calm, but my hands were shaking as I reached for a loaf of bread. Or the time her husband invited me over for a barbecue. I stood there in their backyard, surrounded by laughter and the smell of grilled meat, and all I could think about was that night in the tent. Every interaction with her was a reminder of what we'd done, of the line we'd crossed. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to stay away. There was a pull, an invisible thread that kept drawing me back, even when I knew it was wrong. Guilt is a strange thing. It doesn't come all at once, like a tidal wave. It creeps in slowly, seeping into every corner of your mind until there's no escaping it. At first, I told myself it was a mistake, an isolated moment of weakness. But the truth was, it didn't feel like a mistake. It felt inevitable. And that's what scared me the most. There were nights when I couldn't sleep, lying awake and replaying everything over and over in my head. I'd think about her, about the way she smiled, the sound of her laughter, the way her hand had lingered on mine for just a second too long. But I'd also think about her husband, about his kindness, his trust, his complete obliviousness. It made me sick to my stomach, the thought of betraying someone who'd done nothing but treat me like a friend. And yet, despite the guilt, despite the shame, there was a part of me that didn't regret it. A part of me that cherished the memory of that night, that held onto it like a lifeline. I hated myself for it, but I couldn't let it go. Have you ever found yourself torn between what you know is right and what you feel in your heart? It's a question I've asked myself 1,000 times since that night. And every time, I come up with a different answer. Maybe you've been there too, standing at the crossroads of morality and desire, unsure of which path to take. If you have, I want to hear your story. Share it in the comments below, or just let me know what you think. Because if there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that sometimes, the hardest part isn't making the choice. It's living with it. There's a saying, secrets have a way of eating at you, no matter how tightly you try to lock them away. And I've learned just how true that is. At first, I told myself it was better this way, that keeping the secret was an act of kindness, a way to shield everyone from the fallout. But over time, I began to realize that the silence wasn't just protecting others, it was suffocating me. Every interaction with her, every friendly wave from her husband, every neighborhood gathering was a reminder of the lie I was living. The weight of it settled on my chest like a stone, growing heavier with every passing day. But it wasn't just the guilt. It was the loneliness that came with it. Keeping a secret like this creates a barrier, an invisible wall between you and the people around you. You can't look them in the eye without wondering, if they knew the truth, would they still see me the same way? Would they still trust me? Would they still care? And then there's the fear, the constant gnawing fear that one day, the truth will come out. That one careless word, one slip of the tongue, one wrong move could unravel everything. It's a fear that keeps you on edge, always looking over your shoulder, always questioning who you can trust. But perhaps the hardest part is the self-doubt. The endless questioning of your own character, your own morality. Am I a bad person? Did I let my emotions cloud my judgment? Or am I just human, flawed and fallible like everyone else? It's not just about what we did that night. It's about what it says about me, about her, about the choices we make when no one is watching. And that's the thing about secrets. They force you to confront parts of yourself you'd rather ignore. They hold up a mirror to your flaws, your weaknesses, your humanity. So I'll ask you, what would you do if you were in my shoes? Could you live with the weight of a secret like this? Or would you feel the need to unburden yourself, no matter the cost? It's not an easy question to answer, but it's one I've wrestled with every single day since that night. For a long time, I felt trapped by what happened, like I was stuck in a cycle of guilt and shame that I couldn't break free from. But eventually, I realized that I had two choices. I could let that night define me, or I could use it as a catalyst for change. I chose the latter. It wasn't easy. At first, I didn't even know where to start. But I knew I couldn't keep living the way I was, consumed by guilt and fear. So I started small. I focused on being a better person in the ways I could control. I became more present with my friends and family, more honest in my relationships, more intentional in my actions. I also began to reflect on why that night happened in the first place. What was I searching for in that moment? What was missing in my life that made me cross that line? The answers weren't easy to face. They forced me to confront parts of myself I didn't want to see. My insecurities, my need for validation, my fear of vulnerability. But facing those truths was the only way I could start to grow. I also realized the importance of forgiveness, not just for others, but for myself. Holding on to self-loathing wasn't helping anyone. It was only keeping me stuck. So I made a decision to forgive myself, not to excuse what I did, but to accept it as a part of my story, a part of my journey. And in doing so, I found a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. Does that mean I've completely moved on? No. There are still days when the guilt creeps in, when I find myself replaying that night in my mind. But those moments don't define me anymore. Instead, they remind me of how far I've come, and how much further I still want to go. I'm not sharing this story to seek sympathy or to justify my actions. I'm sharing it because I think there's value in confronting the messy, complicated parts of ourselves. We all have moments we're not proud of. Moments where we let our emotions get the better of us, where we make choices we wish we could take back. But those moments don't have to define us. What matters is what we do afterward. How we learn, how we grow, how we strive to be better. So I want to ask you, have you ever faced a moment like this? A moment where you were forced to confront your own flaws, your own humanity? If you have, I'd love to hear your story. Share it in the comments below, or just let me know what you think. Because at the end of the day, we're all just trying to navigate this messy, complicated thing called life. And maybe, just maybe, by sharing our stories, we can help each other along the way. As I look back on that night and everything that followed, I can't help but feel a mix of emotions. On one hand, it was a moment of connection, a fleeting experience that felt profound in its intensity. But on the other hand, it was a breach of trust, a decision that carried consequences far beyond that single night. I've spent countless nights replaying the events in my mind, trying to make sense of it all. What led me to that moment? Was it loneliness? Was it a need to feel desired, understood, or simply alive? And what about her? Did she feel the same pull, the same desire to escape from whatever confines she was living in? Or was it something different entirely? A shared moment of vulnerability, a mutual understanding that words could never capture? What's clear to me now is that the answers don't really matter. What matters is the lesson. The reminder that our actions, no matter how private, have ripples. That a single choice, made in a moment of weakness or longing, can shape the course of our lives in ways we never anticipated. I've come to see that night as a turning point. Not because of what happened, but because of what it taught me. It forced me to confront parts of myself I'd been avoiding for years. It made me question my values, my priorities, and the kind of person I want to be. And for that, in a strange way, I'm grateful. Because without that experience, I might never have taken the time to reflect, to grow, to strive for something better. As I share this story with you, I can't help but wonder, how many of you have found yourselves in situations you never anticipated? Maybe it wasn't a moment like mine. Maybe it was a decision made in the heat of an argument, a choice driven by fear, or a secret you've carried for years. Whatever it was, I think we can all relate to the feeling of being caught between who we are and who we want to be. Life is full of temptations and challenges, moments that test our character and our resolve. Sometimes, we rise to the occasion. Other times, we stumble. But isn't that what it means to be human? To be flawed, to make mistakes, and to find our way forward, one step at a time? This story isn't just about me or that night in the tent. It's about all of us, the choices we make, the regrets we carry, and the growth we strive for. It's about trust, not just in others, but in ourselves. It's about temptation, and the way it can creep into our lives when we least expect it. It's about regret, and the way it can shape us, for better or worse. And above all, it's about growth. The slow, painful, but ultimately rewarding process of becoming the person we want to be. So I'll ask you, what themes from this story resonate with you? Have you ever faced a moment where trust was tested, where temptation led you down a path you didn't expect? How did you navigate it? What did you learn? In the end, I've come to believe that a single secret doesn't define who we are. It's how we respond to it, how we learn from it, that truly matters. We're all more than the sum of our mistakes. We're the lessons we learn, the growth we achieve, and the kindness we show to ourselves and to others. So, I'll leave you with this question. Can a single secret define who we are, or is it how we learn from it that truly matters? Think about it. Reflect on it. And if you feel comfortable, share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if this story resonated with you, share it with someone who might understand. Don't forget to subscribe for more personal confessions and life lessons. We all have stories worth sharing, moments worth reflecting on. Thank you for listening to mine. Until next time, take care and be kind to yourself and to others. Asterisk. What's your take on this story? Let us know in the comments below.